The smallest bedroom in my grandmother's lake house had always been an afterthought, a narrow space tucked behind the laundry room with a single window facing the side fence, and when my family handed me that room during our annual reunion, they did it with the kind of smiles that were meant to look harmless. My cousin Ashley laughed first. My uncle called it tradition. My mother avoided eye contact altogether. At 28, I was used to being underestimated, but that weekend felt different. The jokes lasted longer. The whispers stopped whenever I entered a room. During dinner, I caught my brother sliding a folder beneath the table to my aunt while everyone pretended not to notice. Then I heard 6 words that changed everything. She still doesn't know, does she? Nobody realized I was standing in the hallway when they said it. Nobody realized I saw the nervous glance my aunt gave toward the grandfather clock. And nobody realized that 3 days earlier, a man from the bank had called me personally and asked whether he should still arrive on Saturday morning as scheduled. So while my family laughed about my tiny bedroom and treated me like an unwanted guest in a house filled with memories, I quietly checked the time and waited for the knock at the front door. My name is Claire, and for as long as I could remember, my family had assigned me a role before I ever walked into a room. I was the quiet daughter, the practical cousin, the one people called dependable when they wanted help and forgettable when they wanted attention. Growing up, I watched relatives celebrate my brother's promotions, my cousin's engagements, and even my aunt's minor accomplishments with speeches and champagne while my own successes passed through conversations like background noise. I never fought for recognition because I learned early that attention gained through arguments rarely lasted. What mattered was knowing the truth, even when everyone else preferred a convenient story. By the time our family reunion arrived that July, the atmosphere felt strangely rehearsed. Every interaction carried an invisible tension. My aunt kept taking private phone calls on the back porch. My uncle stopped talking whenever I entered the kitchen. Even my mother seemed distracted, as if she were waiting for something she couldn't control. The smallest bedroom became the latest joke, but it wasn't really about the room. It was about reminding me where they believed I belonged. What they didn't know was that my grandmother had shared something with me 8 months before her death, something she made me promise not to reveal until the right moment arrived, and that moment was getting very close. The reunion officially began on Friday evening, but most of the family had arrived hours earlier, turning my grandmother's lake house into a carefully staged performance before I even pulled into the driveway. The property sat on 12 acres outside Madison County, a place my grandparents had purchased in 1978 when the area was little more than farmland and gravel roads. To everyone else, it was a vacation house. To my grandmother, it had always been the center of the family. As I carried my suitcase inside, I noticed the seating arrangement in the living room had already been claimed. My brother Daniel occupied Grandpa's leather chair. My Aunt Susan sat near the fireplace. My cousins clustered around the dining table. The only empty place was a folding chair near the hallway. "There she is," Susan announced with a smile that felt rehearsed. "Your room is ready." The room, of course, was the smallest one in the house. Ashley laughed when she showed it to me. "We figured you wouldn't mind. You're hardly ever here anyway." The others chuckled. I smiled politely and set my bag down. There was no reason to argue over a room. Not when I was paying attention to far more important things. At dinner, the conversation revolved around family history, future plans, and property maintenance. That last topic appeared far more often than usual. Susan asked who would handle taxes going forward. Daniel mentioned repair costs. My Uncle Robert brought up insurance coverage twice in less than 20 minutes. Most people would have dismissed the comments as ordinary discussion. I didn't. My grandmother had spent her entire life teaching me that when people wanted something badly, they eventually started talking around it before talking about it directly. That night, I watched them carefully. Every mention of the lake house seemed connected to an expectation. An assumption. As though certain decisions had already been made without being announced. Around 10 o'clock, I stepped onto the back porch with a cup of tea. The summer air was warm, and the lake reflected the moonlight in long silver streaks. That was when I heard voices drifting from the side deck. Daniel and Susan. Neither realized I was nearby. The paperwork should be finalized next week, Daniel said quietly. Good. The sooner we handle it, the better, Susan replied. And Claire? She won't be a problem. They both laughed. Not loudly. Just confidently. The kind of laugh people share when they believe they have already won. I returned inside without making a sound. The next morning began with breakfast and another round of subtle insults disguised as jokes. Ashley asked whether I was still renting my apartment. My uncle questioned whether my consulting business was stable enough to be considered a real company. Daniel smirked through most of it. Years earlier, comments like those might have bothered me. By 28, they mostly provided information. People revealed their intentions when they underestimated someone. They became careless. At 9:14 a.m., my phone vibrated. It was a text message. Good morning, Claire. Confirming my arrival at 11 a.m. as requested by Mrs. Evelyn Harper's trust instructions. The message came from Richard Lawson, the branch manager of the local bank. I stared at the screen for several seconds before locking my phone again. 8 months earlier, shortly before entering hospice care, my grandmother had invited me to lunch alone. She brought a sealed folder and spent nearly 2 hours explaining documents I wasn't allowed to discuss with anyone. There will come a time, she told me, when everyone believes they understand what I intended. Wait until the right people arrive before saying a word. I had honored that promise. Now, as I looked through the dining room window and watched my relatives laughing over coffee, I realized the right people were almost here. At 10:47 a.m., the mood inside the lake house was unusually relaxed. My relatives moved through the morning with the confidence of people who believed every important decision had already been settled. Daniel and Uncle Robert stood near the garage discussing renovation costs. Ashley scrolled through furniture catalogs at the dining table. Aunt Susan kept mentioning future plans for the property as if ownership were already a formality. Nobody noticed how often the conversation drifted toward upgrades, resale values, and potential vacation rentals. Nobody except me. I sat on the porch swing with a glass of iced tea and listened without interrupting. The more they talked, the clearer the picture became. They weren't discussing possibilities. They were discussing expectations. My grandmother had been gone for 6 months, and somehow everyone seemed remarkably certain about what would happen next. The certainty itself was interesting because I knew something they didn't. At exactly 10:59 a.m., a dark sedan turned into the driveway. I recognized the vehicle immediately. The conversation inside the house slowed as the car approached. "Who's that?" Ashley asked. My uncle glanced through the window. No idea. The sedan parked near the front entrance. A man in a navy suit stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. The moment Susan saw him, confusion crossed her face. Then concern. She looked toward Daniel. Daniel looked toward Robert. Nobody appeared to recognize him. I stood. "I'll get the door." The room became quiet as I walked across the hardwood floor. When I opened the front door, Richard Lawson extended his hand. "Good morning, Claire." "Good morning, Richard." The silence behind me deepened. I invited him inside. "Everyone," I said calmly, "this is Richard Lawson from First County Bank." Aunt Susan frowned. "The bank?" Richard nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Daniel laughed. "Did Grandma leave unpaid bills or something?" A few people chuckled. Richard didn't. Instead, he opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope along with several official-looking folders. "I'm here regarding instructions left by Mrs. Evelyn Harper," he said. Every smile disappeared. The room suddenly felt smaller. My grandmother had always been organized, but few people knew just how organized she truly was. During the final years of her life, she documented everything. Financial records, property documents, trust agreements, investment accounts. She believed clarity prevented conflict. Unfortunately, clarity often arrives after people have already created their own versions of the story. Susan crossed her arms. We already handled the estate process. Richard looked at her kindly. Not entirely. The room went still again. What does that mean? Robert asked. Richard placed the sealed envelope on the dining table. Mrs. Harper established a private trust amendment approximately 11 months before her passing. The amendment included delayed disclosure instructions. Daniel's expression changed. A trust amendment? Yes. That would have been disclosed. Not under the conditions specified. Nobody looked comfortable anymore. Ashley slowly lowered her phone. Susan's confidence appeared to be fading by the minute. I remained silent. My grandmother had specifically instructed me not to explain anything prematurely. She wanted the documents to speak for themselves. Looking around the room, I finally understood why. Richard opened one of the folders. The amendment required that specific financial information remain confidential until 6 months after Mrs. Harper's death and only be presented during a family gathering attended by all direct beneficiaries. The realization hit several faces at once. This meeting. This weekend. This was the event she had planned for. Daniel leaned forward. What financial information? Richard removed another document. Over the last 17 years, Mrs. Harper maintained a separate investment portfolio associated with the family property. Susan blinked. A separate portfolio? Yes. How much? Richard glanced at the paperwork. Current valuation as of June 14 is approximately $7,400,000. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. Ashley actually laughed once, assuming she had heard incorrectly. Then she noticed nobody else was laughing. The room became so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. For the first time all weekend, every member of my family was staring at the same thing. Not the lake house. Not the inheritance. Not each other. They were staring at the documents my grandmother had spent nearly a year preparing. And Richard still hadn't opened the envelope. The grandfather clock struck 11 as everyone remained frozen around the dining table. The number Richard had just announced seemed to linger in the room long after he spoke it. $7,400,000. My Aunt Susan sat down slowly as though her knees had suddenly become unreliable. Ashley stared at the folders without blinking. Uncle Robert removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Daniel, who normally had an answer for everything, looked completely speechless. For years, family conversations about the lake house had revolved around maintenance costs, taxes, and eventual ownership. Nobody had ever mentioned an investment portfolio attached to the property. More importantly, nobody had imagined that my grandmother had quietly built one for nearly 2 decades without discussing it openly. Richard waited until the silence settled before continuing. Mrs. Harper left extensive written instructions regarding the purpose of these funds. He slid a document across the table. Susan immediately reached for it. Her eyes moved quickly across the page. Then slower. Then slower still. What is this? She asked. Richard answered calmly. It is a summary of the trust amendment. Daniel stood and moved beside her. As he read, the confidence drained from his expression. What do you mean annual withdrawals? He asked. Richard opened another folder. The portfolio generated regular distributions for property expenses. Mrs. Harper personally covered those expenses through the trust for many years. Robert frowned. Covered what expenses? Richard flipped to a spreadsheet. Property taxes. Insurance. Structural repairs. Utility upgrades. Roof replacement in 2019. Dock reconstruction in 2021. The room shifted. I watched the realization arrive one person at a time. For years, everyone had assumed various family members were contributing to maintain the property. The records told a different story. My grandmother had quietly paid for almost everything herself. Susan's face tightened. That can't be right. Richard slid additional paperwork toward her. Every transaction is documented. The dates stretched back nearly 17 years. Invoices. Bank transfers. Contractor payments. Insurance records. Detailed notes written in my grandmother's careful handwriting. Nobody argued after that. Facts have a way of ending debates. Then Richard reached for the sealed envelope. The atmosphere changed immediately. Everyone noticed. Even before he touched it. My grandmother had been very specific about the envelope. I knew because she had told me during our final lunch together. This, she had said while placing her hand on it, is the part people won't expect. Richard examined the seal. This document contains Mrs. Harper's final beneficiary instructions. Susan leaned forward. Daniel folded his arms. Ashley stopped pretending to check her phone. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. Richard carefully opened the envelope and unfolded several pages. The first page contained a handwritten letter. My family, he began reading, if you are hearing this, then Richard has followed my instructions exactly as I intended. The room became perfectly silent. I have spent many years observing not what people say, but what they do. Character reveals itself during ordinary moments. Especially when nobody believes they are being evaluated. Susan looked uncomfortable. Daniel stared at the table. Richard continued. Some of you measured contribution by opinion. Others measured it by inheritance. I measured it by responsibility. My pulse remained steady. I already knew what was coming. The rest of the room did not. Over the last decade, only one family member consistently helped me review financial records, manage appointments, organize documents, and protect the future of this property without expecting recognition. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. Richard turned the page. That person is Claire. The reaction was immediate. Ashley's eyes widened. Robert looked stunned. Daniel slowly lifted his head. Susan's expression became almost impossible to read. Richard continued. Claire never asked about inheritance. She never requested ownership. She never pressured me regarding my finances. She simply helped whenever help was needed. The room felt smaller with every sentence. Then Richard reached the final paragraph. The paragraph that changed everything. He paused briefly. Then read it aloud. Effective upon my death, controlling authority over the Harper Property Trust, associated investment portfolio, and all related assets shall transfer exclusively to Claire Harper. For a second, nobody reacted. It was as though the words required time to become real. Then every face in the room turned toward me. And for the first time all weekend, nobody was laughing. For several seconds after Richard finished reading, the room existed in complete silence. The kind of silence that arrives when people realize the future they imagined no longer exists. Susan stared at me as if she were waiting for someone to explain that there had been a misunderstanding. Daniel looked between the documents and my face, searching for evidence that this had somehow been arranged behind his back. Ashley's mouth remained slightly open. Even Uncle Robert, who always seemed prepared with an opinion, had nothing to say. The only sound came from the grandfather clock continuing its steady rhythm in the hallway. Tick. 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 time moving forward whether anyone liked it or not. Finally, Susan spoke. You knew? The question wasn't angry at first. Just stunned. I met her gaze. I knew there were documents. And you didn't tell anyone? No. Why not? I looked toward Richard. Because Grandma asked me not to. Nobody challenged that answer. My grandmother had been many things, but nobody in the family would have accused her of making careless decisions. If she had established instructions, people followed them. Daniel stood abruptly. This doesn't make sense. Richard calmly adjusted the paperwork. Which part? All of it. The documents are legally valid. That's not what I mean. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Why would she leave everything to Claire? The answer came from the letter itself. Richard tapped the page. She explained her reasoning. Susan folded her arms. That doesn't mean it's fair. The moment the word left her mouth, I saw something change in several expressions around the room. Fair. For years, fairness had rarely entered family discussions when I was the one being overlooked. Nobody had worried about fairness when my accomplishments were ignored. Nobody had worried about fairness when jokes were made at my expense. Nobody had worried about fairness when they gave me the smallest room in the house every single reunion. Now fairness had suddenly become very important. I remained calm. Grandma made her decision. Susan looked away. Because there wasn't really an argument available. The documents were clear. The trust was clear. The letter was clear. Most importantly, my grandmother's intentions were clear. Over the next hour, Richard reviewed the remaining paperwork. Every signature was verified. Every transfer was documented. Every legal requirement had already been satisfied months earlier. By the time he finished, the reality had become unavoidable. The lake house remained protected. The investment portfolio remained intact. And responsibility for both now belonged to me. Eventually, people began drifting into smaller conversations. Ashley became unusually quiet. Robert spent most of his time reading financial summaries. Susan sat near the window staring out at the lake. Daniel disappeared outside. Around 3 o'clock, I stepped onto the back porch. A few minutes later, Daniel joined me. For a while neither of us spoke. Then he sighed. I really thought Grandma would have divided everything equally. I know. You aren't surprised. No. He leaned against the railing. Did she ever tell you why she trusted you so much? I thought about that lunch 8 months earlier. The sunlight through the restaurant windows. The folder on the table. The seriousness in her voice. Then I smiled slightly. Yes. What did she say? I looked across the water. She said responsibility is what people do when nobody is watching. Daniel didn't answer. Because deep down, he knew exactly what she meant. By sunset, the reunion felt completely different from the one that had started 24 hours earlier. Nobody mentioned bedrooms anymore. Nobody made jokes about my career. Nobody questioned whether my business was successful. The people who had spent years deciding my place in the family were suddenly forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. As for me, I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The most satisfying part wasn't receiving the trust. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the property. It was watching the truth arrive on its own. Because while everyone else spent years deciding who they thought I was, my grandmother quietly paid attention to who I actually was. And in the end, that made all the difference. The reunion ended the next morning with far fewer conversations than it began with. Cars pulled out of the driveway one by one, and for the first time in years, nobody seemed interested in assigning seats, rooms, or roles. The labels that had followed me through childhood suddenly felt meaningless. As I stood on the porch overlooking the lake, I thought about my grandmother's final lesson. She never wasted energy convincing people to see her value. She simply lived it. Eventually, the truth became impossible to ignore. In the months that followed, I kept the property exactly as she intended. The trust continued supporting the house, the land remained protected, and family gatherings stayed open to everyone willing to respect what she built. Some relationships slowly improved. Others remained distant. I accepted both outcomes. Not every ending requires reconciliation. Sometimes closure comes from understanding that you were never who people said you were. You were simply waiting for the right moment for the truth to arrive. And when it finally does, it speaks louder than any argument ever could. If you've ever stayed silent while people underestimated you, subscribe. Because sometimes the strongest victories happen without a single raised voice, and some stories deserve to be heard all the way to the end.